In the final days of December 1781 and into the early months of 1782, a handful of newspapers published brief, unsettling accounts of what would come to be known as the James Yates murders. James Yates was born in Westchester County. According to the Pennsylvania Packet, those who knew him, his neighbors, spoke with disbelief. He had always seemed a healthy, sane man, someone they'd never imagined capable of such brutality. Yates had once been part of a devout religious group, the Society of Shakers. But on one fateful night, something changed. Yates claimed he was overtaken, tempted to this horrid deed by the spirit. What followed was the slaughter of his entire family, his wife and 4 children. 3 of the children were murdered inside the house. His wife, with the youngest child on her back, was discovered on the road nearby, likely cut down while trying to flee. A club, thought to be the murder weapon, was found beside them. The wounds told the story, blunt force to the head. The carnage didn't stop there. Yates also killed many of his animals, cattle, a dog, and even 2 horses. By morning, he appeared at his parents' home, naked. He confessed to the killings, but at first, his parents dismissed it as delusions, until they saw the bodies with their own eyes. Yates, by then, was clearly disturbed. He denied the dead were his family, insisting instead that his wife had been a Native American. He seemed detached, even claiming that what he'd done was justified, and showed little remorse. His brother, present at the scene, managed to calm and control him. Yates was not immediately restrained, but he was eventually taken into custody and imprisoned in Albany. In the years that followed the Yates tragedy, newspapers fell largely silent. Little more was said until 15 years later in 1796. That summer, the New York Weekly magazine published a 2-part article titled An Account of a Murder Committed by Mr. James Yates Upon His Family in December of 1781. The story was submitted by someone calling herself Anna. She claimed her account came from a woman who had personally known James Yates. But even at the time, readers questioned the authenticity of the tale, largely due to its rich detail and the suspicious delay in its publication. Still, the narrative paints a chilling portrait of that night. According to this version, the Yates family had hosted a small religious gathering at their home. His sister stayed later than most guests. Throughout the evening, Yates behaved lovingly, especially towards his wife. She had expressed a desire to travel to New Hampshire, and he'd promised to take her the very next morning. After his sister left, James and his wife sat together, reading the Bible. She cradled their infant, their eldest child nearby, while the 2 other children slept peacefully. And then, it happened. Yates claimed to see a strange light. A spirit appeared and spoke to him, commanding him to rid himself of his idols. He began by throwing the Bible into the fire. Then, grabbing an axe, he destroyed the family sleigh and slaughtered their animals. But the voices returned. You have more idols. Look at your wife and children. And so, the horror began. He entered the children's room and, in a violent frenzy, threw his 2 sons, one against a wall and the other into the fireplace. Both died instantly. By the time he turned his back, his wife had fled, carrying the infant in her arms. Outside, he spotted her running in the direction of her parents' home. He struck her down with the axe. The infant fell from her arms, and Yates ended her life by hurling her small body against a nearby fence. For a moment, James Yates seemed to awaken. Seeing his wife in pain, he embraced her tenderly. But the voice returned once more. Driven again by madness, he tore a stake from the fence and beat his wife to death. Then, almost ritualistically, he placed the body of the infant on top of her. There was still 1 child left. Yates found his daughter hiding in the barn. He dragged her to the spot where her mother and sister now lay. He ordered her to dance around the bodies, tormenting her as he weighed whether to let her live. In the end, he brought the axe down upon her head. With his idols gone, Yates paused to reflect. He knew the consequences: prison, or worse. He considered burning the house down and blaming it all on a native attack. But he refused. As he later explained, he believed he had a good motive for his actions, and that lying would only dishonor it. At dawn, Yates appeared at his sister's home. Blood still covered his hands. Disorientated and raving, he reached for a knife. But his sister managed to resist him. She tied him down, ran for help, and informed their neighbors. Yates was taken to Tom Hannock. There, a religious man, referred to only as Mr. W., tried to reason with him. But Yates refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. He showed no remorse. Later, while staying with a woman known as Miss B., Yates recounted the entire event, still convinced that the spirit's instructions had been righteous. Eventually, James Yates was imprisoned in Albany. It is said he escaped twice. George Wythe was born in 1726 at Chesterville, a plantation that had been in his family for 3 generations. His maternal grandfather was George Keith, a Quaker minister and one of the early voices against slavery. Wythe's mother, Margaret Walker, was a well-educated woman, likely raised in the Quaker tradition. She passed on to her son a deep love of learning that would shape his future. In his later years, Wythe became known for his old-fashioned Quaker attire and gentle, unshakable demeanor. So gentle, in fact, it was said even a bad-tempered dog would soften and wag its tail in his presence. After losing his father at a young age, Wythe likely attended grammar school in Williamsburg, then began his legal training under his uncle, Stephen Dewey, in Prince George County. He married for the first time on December 26, 1747. At 21, he was a rising county lawyer in Western Virginia when he wed Anne Lewis, daughter of his law partner Zachary Lewis, in Spotsylvania County. But the joy was short-lived. Anne passed away less than a year later in August of 1748. Heartbroken, Wythe returned to Chesterville and soon took a position as a clerk for the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. 6 years later, after being elected to that very same house, Wythe married again, this time to Elizabeth Talia Fierro of Williamsburg. The couple had one child, who tragically died in infancy. Elizabeth herself would pass away after 32 years of marriage in 1787. Although George Wythe was 79 years old, he remained healthy and full of vigor. With his only child having died in infancy decades earlier, Wythe had written a will, sometime around 1803, leaving a significant portion of his estate to George Sweeney, his sister's grandson, who had been named after him. But Sweeney, just 17 at the time, was already known as a heavy drinker and gambler. When he moved in with Wythe in 1805, he quickly took advantage of the old man's trust, stealing books to sell and forging Wythe's signature on bank checks to cover his mounting debts. Wythe had also arranged for settlements to support 3 individuals he had formerly enslaved: Lydia Broadnax, whom he freed in 1787, her 16-year-old son Michael Brown, and an adult man named Benjamin, freed in 1797. All were to share in Wythe's estate, along with Sweeney. But as the young man grew desperate to keep his crimes hidden, and knowing he stood to inherit, he may have decided to eliminate the others. A shopkeeper would later testify that he sold arsenic to Sweeney, and Broadnax would recall seeing him put something into the coffee pot that Sunday morning, May 25, 1806. Wythe, Broadnax, and young Brown all drank from it. What followed was horrific. Both Wythe and Brown endured slow, painful deaths, Brown passing on June 1st, and Wythe a week later on June 8th. Only Broadnax survived. As Wythe lay on his deathbed, the truth began to surface. The forged checks were discovered, and on June 1st, a judge amended Wythe's will, officially disinheriting George Sweeney. On June 18, 1806, George Sweeney was arrested and formally charged with murder. His trial began just a few months later on September 2nd. The most compelling testimony came from Lydia Broadnax, Wyth's longtime cook and trusted household member. She recounted that she had seen on the morning of May 25th Sweeney alone in the kitchen, acting suspiciously around the coffee pot. She remembered drinking a small amount of that coffee and falling ill. So did Wyth, and so did young Michael Brown. When all three grew violently sick that same day, Broadnax became convinced Sweeney had poisoned the pot. But in the courtroom, her words were silenced. Despite the weight of her account, Broadnax's testimony, along with that of the other black servants, was barred from evidence. The judges followed Virginia law at the time, which prohibited black witnesses from testifying against a white defendant in a criminal trial. The court did, however, allow hearsay testimony, so long as it came from white witnesses. One man testified that Sweeney had purchased arsenic. A jailer admitted Sweeney hadn't been searched upon arrest, and later, a packet containing arsenic was found in the jail yard, possibly tossed from a cell window. Another witness claimed that Wyth, from his deathbed, had asked him to search Sweeney's room, where he found a container of arsenic. But because the key testimony came from black witnesses, and because the most incriminating statements were considered hearsay under the law, the jury had little to work with. On September 8th, the verdict was delivered: not guilty.